They say curiosity can be deadly, and tonight, it just might be. For the next 2 hours, you'll journey into abandoned towns, deep forests, remote cabins, and lonely mountain trails. You'll meet things that watch from the shadows, stalk the night, and follow you when you think you're alone. These aren't just stories, they're real encounters, experienced by people around the world. These videos take a lot of time and dedication to create. If you want to support my efforts, the best way is to like, share, and subscribe. It really means a lot. Okay, if you're ready, let's step into tonight's terrifying stories. This happened to me in the summer of 2018, when I went camping alone in northern Michigan. I've told a few people about it, but every time I do, I get the same look, a mixture of disbelief and pity, like they think I was just scared of the dark or half dreaming. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw the next morning, and I know I'll never go into those woods again. Camping was something I'd always loved. I'm not talking about pulling your car into a designated campground with 50 other families. I mean real camping. Hiking miles into the backcountry, away from roads, phones, electricity, everything. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the wilderness. It gave me peace. Or at least it used to. That trip started out like any other. I drove out to a trailhead around noon on a hot July afternoon. The sun was beating down, and the air smelled of pine and dirt. I remember being surprised that the lot was completely empty. Not a single other car. That should have been a good sign. Total solitude. But instead, it gave me a weird feeling. A tightness in my chest. Still, I shouldered my backpack and started the 3-mile hike into the forest. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No bird calls. No rustling in the underbrush. Even the insects seemed gone. That silence was the first thing that unsettled me, though I pushed it aside. After about 3 hours, I reached the spot I had marked on my map. It was perfect on paper. Flat ground, a nearby stream for water, surrounded by thick trees that blocked the wind. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and made myself dinner. I sat by the flames until the sky went black and the forest closed in around me. Normally, the darkness in the woods doesn't bother me. But that night, the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. When I finally crawled into my tent, I lay awake listening to the absence of sound. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just my own breathing. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I remember is waking up to footsteps. They were slow, heavy, deliberate. The sound of something large moving just outside my tent. My body went rigid. I told myself it had to be a deer or maybe even a bear, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The weight of those footsteps, they were too heavy, too purposeful. I reached for my flashlight, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it on. The thin nylon of the tent suddenly felt like nothing at all, like a sheet of paper between me and whatever was out there. The footsteps circled the clearing, crunching over leaves and snapping twigs. Then they stopped, and that's when I heard it. A sound that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. A long, deep exhale, right outside my tent wall. I stopped breathing. Every muscle in my body screamed at me not to move, not to make a sound. The shadow of something massive pressed lightly against the fabric, bending it inward. I could see the shape in the faint light of the moon above me, tall, broad, hunched. It stood there for what felt like forever, listening, breathing. Finally, the weight shifted. The sound of footsteps dragged away into the woods, slow and deliberate, until the silence swallowed them. I lay frozen until dawn, gripping that flashlight so tight my hand cramped. I didn't sleep another second. When the first pale light of morning touched the tent, I forced myself outside. My fire had gone out hours ago. The forest was alive again with birds and insects, as if nothing had happened. But then I saw the ground. The dirt around my tent was marked with prints. Huge ones, bigger than any boot, and not shaped like anything human. They were wide and flat with strange, claw-like extensions at the front, pressed deep into the earth. They circled my tent more than once. I didn't pack up carefully. I stuffed everything into my bag, collapsed the tent in seconds, and hiked straight out of those woods without stopping for water or rest. I felt eyes on me the whole way back, though I never heard another sound. When I got to the trailhead and saw my car sitting alone, relief almost knocked me off my feet. I didn't look back as I drove away. A few weeks later, I told a park ranger about what I'd experienced. He didn't laugh. He didn't tell me I was imagining things. He just nodded slowly and said, "You're not the first. People hear it outside their tent sometimes. Most of them never see the prints. You were lucky." Lucky. That's the word he used. But I don't feel lucky. I feel like something out there found me, and for reasons I'll never understand, it let me go. I've been a long-haul trucker for over 20 years. I've seen more miles of open highway than I can count, more diners, rest stops, and forgotten little towns than most people even know exist. And let me tell you, there are things out there on the roads at night, things that don't belong. Truckers don't talk about it much. Maybe because we're afraid of sounding crazy, or maybe because deep down we know talking about it makes it too real. But I can't shake what happened to me one night back in 2015 when I was hauling freight through the back highways of Wyoming. It started out as a normal run. I had a refrigerated trailer loaded with produce out of Idaho, bound for Denver. The trip wasn't supposed to be complicated, but a traffic accident on the interstate forced me onto a detour, a two-lane blacktop that wound through endless stretches of farmland and forest. No lights, no towns for 60 miles, just my rig, the hum of the engine, and the dark ribbon of road cutting through nothing. The night was pitch black, the kind of black you only find in places where human light hasn't touched. The stars overhead were sharp and cold, and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. My headlights carved out maybe 100 feet ahead of me, and beyond that, just darkness pressing in on every side. I'd been driving for about 2 hours when I saw the first strange thing, a shape on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just roadkill, a deer maybe, or a coyote. But as I drew closer, I realized it was standing, tall, motionless, a figure, pale as chalk, standing right on the shoulder, facing the road. I swore out loud, gripping the wheel. My headlights lit it up, and for a split second I saw it clearly, a person. Or at least, it looked like a person, but its proportions were wrong. Too thin, arms too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, like its neck couldn't quite support it. I blasted past it at 60 miles an hour, and when I checked my mirrors, there was nothing there. Now, I've had nights on the road where I've gotten tired, where shadows play tricks on me, where exhaustion makes me see things. But this was early in the drive. I wasn't tired. I wasn't hallucinating. And worse, this wouldn't be the last time I saw it that night. About 20 miles later, my CB crackled. I hadn't touched it all night. Nobody was on these back roads at this hour. But suddenly, a voice cut through the static. "You shouldn't be out here." Just like that. Flat calm, almost bored. I froze. "Who is this?" I asked. Silence. Then just static. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was some bored driver messing around on an open frequency. But my gut told me otherwise. A few minutes later, I saw it again. Standing in the road this time. Dead center, blocking my lane. I slammed the brakes, tires screaming as the rig shuddered and slowed. My headlights washed over it, and for a second, I thought my heart would stop. It wasn't a man. Not really. Its skin was pale, almost glowing, stretched too tightly over bones that jutted out at odd angles. Its eyes were black pits, swallowing the light. Its mouth was open, but no sound came out. Just a gaping, silent scream. I pulled the horn, the blaring blast tearing through the night, and the figure crumpled forward, collapsing to the ground. But when I inched forward, it wasn't there. The road was empty. I was shaking so bad I had to pull over. I sat there on the shoulder, engine idling, hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles were white. The CB crackled again, soft static, then that same flat voice. Keep driving. I lost it. I slammed the thing off, shoved it away, and forced myself back onto the road. I don't know why I didn't just turn around. Maybe I thought I'd lose more time. Maybe I thought it was better to keep moving than to sit still and wait. But the thing wasn't done with me. The rest of that night was a blur of glimpses. In the tree lane, just beyond the reach of my lights, I'd see it pacing my truck. At every curve of the road, it was there ahead of me, watching. Sometimes I'd glance in my mirrors and catch it clinging to the back of my trailer, too fast to be possible. By the time I saw the faint orange glow of a truck stop on the horizon, I was nearly sobbing with relief. I pulled in, parked under fluorescent lights, and sat in my cab for a long time before I could even move. Other truckers were there, guys I knew. I thought about telling them, but when I opened my mouth, nothing came out. I went inside, got a coffee, sat at the counter under the harsh lights, and tried to convince myself I'd imagined it all. But then I heard a voice at the booth behind me, calm and almost bored. You made it. I turned, heart in my throat, but the booth was empty. I didn't finish my coffee. I got back in my rig and drove until the sun came up, refusing to stop until I hit Denver. I've been on the road ever since, thousands of miles, dozens of states, but I still avoid Wyoming, because I know whatever I saw out there isn't gone. It's still waiting on those roads, in that darkness, for the next poor bastard who takes the wrong detour. And sometimes, when my CB crackles late at night on an empty stretch of highway, I hear it again. This happened to me when I was 19 years old. I made the worst decision of my life. I went into the abandoned Hawthorne State Hospital with 2 friends. People in my hometown used to talk about the place like it was cursed. It had been shut down since the early 90s, left to rot on the edge of the woods just outside of town. The stories said people went in there and never came out. Of course, when you're young, you think those kinds of things are just meant to scare you. The truth is, nothing anyone could have told me would have been enough to prepare me for what I saw inside. The hospital was a hulking ruin, 4 stories tall with boarded-up windows and graffiti-covered walls. The front doors had been chained shut for years, but local kids knew another way in through a broken side entrance. That's where my friends Tyler, Jenna, and I squeezed through one hot July evening. We told ourselves we'd only look around for an hour, just to say we'd done it, then leave before dark. The moment I stepped inside, the air changed. It was cooler than outside, but it wasn't refreshing. It was heavy, damp, like breathing through wet cloth. The smell hit next, mold, rust, and something sour, like rot that had soaked into the walls over decades. We clicked on our flashlights, and the beams sliced through dust and peeling paint. The hallways were long and endless, lined with rusted wheelchairs and broken gurneys. Doors sagged on their hinges. Old hospital charts and crumpled papers littered the floor. We started in what must have been the administrative wing. Files still sat in cabinets, some scattered across the ground. Tyler joked about stealing one for a souvenir, but Jenna and I told him to leave it. Even then, before anything happened, I had this creeping sense that we were being watched. The deeper we went, the worse it got. Every footstep echoed. Every door we opened seemed to groan too loud, like it was protesting. We passed long corridors of patient rooms, each one more depressing than the last. Metal bed frames with no mattresses, windows covered in grime, scribbles on the walls. Some were childish drawings. Others were words I couldn't quite make out, scratched into the plaster. By the time we reached the surgical ward, the sun outside had started to fade. The long windows glowed with weak orange light, but inside it was growing darker by the second. I told Tyler we should leave. He just smirked and said, "What? Scared already?" Jenna didn't laugh. She looked as uneasy as I felt. Still, we followed him deeper. That was when we heard the first sound. At first, it was faint, like the shuffle of feet on tile. We froze, flashlights darting down the hallway. Nothing, just peeling paint and shadow. We told ourselves it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon that had gotten in. But my stomach was tight, my instinct screaming that it wasn't an animal. We should have left then. We didn't. Instead, we went down the stairwell into the basement. The air grew colder with each step. The smell got worse, thick with mildew and something coppery like dried blood. Our lights reflected off long stretches of pipes and exposed wiring. Down there, the silence felt different. Not empty, thick, oppressive, like the walls themselves were listening. We came to a large metal door, hanging slightly open. Tyler pushed it wider, and the sound of the hinges echoed like a scream. Inside was a massive room, lined with operating tables. Rusted instruments lay scattered across trays. Stains marked the floor in dark patches that I didn't want to think about. That's when we heard it again. The footsteps. Louder this time. Closer. Jenna whispered my name. I turned my light, and that was when I saw it. At the far end of the room, between two rusted tables, stood a figure. At first, I thought it was a mannequin, the kind hospitals sometimes used for training. It was pale, almost gray, with sunken features. But then it moved. Its head jerked to the side in a twitching motion, and I saw its eyes. Two pits of shadow that seemed too deep, too empty. I screamed. Tyler swore and dropped his flashlight. Jenna grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises. The figure started walking toward us. Not fast, not slow, just steady, deliberate steps that echoed on the tile. We bolted, out of the room, back into the hallway, up the stairs two at a time. The building seemed to twist around us. Every corridor looked the same, every turn leading us deeper instead of out. My chest burned, my legs shaking, but I didn't stop. None of us did. The footsteps followed, always behind us. Not running, just walking. By some miracle, we found a stairwell that led back to the ground floor. We didn't stop to catch our breath. We sprinted through the hallways until we saw the faint light of the broken side door ahead. We burst out into the night air, collapsing in the tall grass outside. For a long time, none of us said a word. We just sat there gasping, shaking, staring at that black outline of the hospital. When I finally turned my head, I saw it, in the window of the fourth floor, a pale face pressed against the glass, watching us. We never went back. None of us ever talked about it again after that night. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that figure walking toward me in the dark, and I wonder how close it really got before we ran. My name is Thomas Reed, and what I'm about to tell you happened in the fall of 2004, in a small town in Kentucky, where I grew up. I was 21 then, still living with my parents, working at a gas station at night, and spending most of my free time with my best friend, Kyle. We both had that restless kind of energy, always looking for something stupid to do, some kind of thrill. And at a town as small as ours, where nothing ever really happened, that usually meant breaking into abandoned barns, sneaking into old buildings, or testing the local ghost stories. The one place we'd always joked about, but never actually gone to, was the old Pine Hill Cemetery. Pine Hill sat just outside the edge of town, at the end of a dirt road that no one bothered to drive down anymore. It was small, maybe 20 or 30 graves, most of them so weathered that the names had faded off the stones. The last person buried there had been in the 1940s. People said it was haunted, that if you went there after midnight, you'd see shadow figures moving among the stones. Some claimed they heard voices calling their names. Others said if you stayed long enough, you'd wake up in the morning outside the gates with no memory of what had happened during the night. That last part sounded like a made-up campfire story, but Kyle thought it would be funny if we went and proved how fake it all was. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea, but I was 21, too proud to admit I was nervous. So one Friday night, just before midnight, we grabbed flashlights, a couple bottles of cheap beer, and walked out there. The cemetery sat behind a rusted iron gate that leaned on broken hinges. The grass was knee-high, and the stones jutted up like crooked teeth. The trees around it were so thick that even though the sky was clear and the moon was bright, inside the cemetery it felt darker. We climbed over the gate and made our way in. I remember the crunch of dead leaves under my boots sounding too loud. I remember the air feeling colder the second we crossed onto the grounds. But Kyle was grinning, waving his flashlight around like it was a game. We walked between the rows of stones, reading what names were still visible. Most were gone, eaten away by time. Some had carvings that looked almost hand-scratched, like whoever had marked the grave didn't have the money for a proper stone. After maybe 20 minutes, Kyle decided we should sit by the biggest monument, the weathered angel statue in the center of the cemetery. Its face was half gone, worn smooth by rain, and its hands were broken off. It was eerie, even in daylight, but under our flashlights it looked almost alive. We sat with our backs against it, drinking, joking, daring each other to call out to the dead. We were young and cocky, laughing too loud, trying to act like we weren't scared. But after a while, the laughter died down, and that was when I noticed the silence. It was absolute. No crickets, no wind in the trees, nothing. The world had gone still. Then came the sound of footsteps. They weren't ours. They weren't animals. These were heavy, slow steps, crunching through the grass just a few feet away. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing, just graves and weeds. Kyle chuckled nervously, said it was probably just a deer, but I saw the way his hand shook when he lifted his beer. The footsteps circled us, moving behind the angel statue, then back around again. Each time I turned my light, nothing, just empty space. Then a voice whispered my name. It was so close, right behind my ear, that I dropped my flashlight. My whole body went cold. Kyle cursed and scrambled to his feet, his light darting everywhere. I picked mine back up, shining it wildly, and that's when I saw it. Between two headstones, standing perfectly still, was a figure. It was tall, too tall, its head almost brushing the low branches of the trees. Its body was blacker than the darkness around it, a shape cut out of the night. "Kyle," I whispered, my throat dry. "Do you see that?" He didn't answer. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide. He saw it too. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching us. Then, slowly, it began to drift forward. Not walk drift. Its legs didn't move. It glided over the ground without a sound, coming closer, closer. We bolted. Neither of us said a word. We just ran. We didn't care about the gate. We scrambled over it so fast, I cut my arm on the rusted iron. We didn't stop running until we hit the dirt road and collapsed, gasping for air. When I looked back, I expected to see the figure standing at the gate, but there was nothing, just darkness. We staggered home in silence, too shaken to speak. I don't even remember saying goodnight to Kyle. I just went straight to bed and passed out. The next morning, I woke up outside. I was lying in the grass by the cemetery gate, the sun on my face. My clothes were damp with dew, my arms still cut from the fence. And Kyle was there too. He was lying on the ground just a few feet away, pale as chalk, his eyes wide open. He was breathing, but he wouldn't respond when I shook him. It took hours before he came back around, blinking like he was lost. He never remembered what happened after we ran. He never remembered waking up outside. We didn't talk about it again. But a month later, Kyle moved away. He wouldn't tell me why. I've been back to Pine Hill Cemetery once since then, in broad daylight, with other people around. And even then, standing by that angel statue, I could feel it. That same oppressive silence, that same weight in the air. Something is still there, watching, waiting. And I know if I ever go back at night, I won't be coming out again. This happened in the fall of 2011, when I was working as a surveyor for a private construction company in upstate New York. My job often meant going into remote forested areas, marking property lines, taking measurements, and making notes for potential development sites. Most of the time, it was peaceful work. I'd be out there with nothing but a compass, a GPS unit, and a notebook. But one particular assignment nearly cost me my life. And even now, years later, I still dream about what I saw out there. The site I was sent to was deep in the Catskills, about 40 miles from the nearest town. My company had been contracted to map a large stretch of privately owned land that might be cleared for future building. The property was huge, thousands of acres of dense forest, steep ridges, and marshy ground. The owner wanted detailed notes, so I packed for a full weekend alone in the woods. The first day went fine. I drove my truck as far up the logging road as I could, then set up a small base camp near a creek. The forest was quiet, but I didn't think much of it. I spent the afternoon walking property lines, hammering markers into trees, taking readings. By evening, I returned to camp, cooked a simple meal, and turned in early. The second day is when things began to feel strange. I had hiked about 2 miles from camp when I found a tree marked with symbols. They weren't survey marks. They weren't hunter carvings either. They looked old, circles with jagged lines cutting through them, like crude runes scratched deep into the bark. At first, I thought maybe some kids had been screwing around, but the cuts were weathered, the grooves filled with moss. These marks had been there a long time. I tried to ignore it and went about my work, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more of those symbols I found. On trees, on rocks, even on the remains of a collapsed cabin I stumbled across. It felt deliberate, like they were surrounding me. By dusk, I was uneasy. I turned back toward camp, but the woods didn't look the same anymore. The trails I thought I'd marked were gone. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth thicker. My GPS blinked with weak signal, refusing to lock onto satellites. Every direction I turned, the terrain looked unfamiliar. I told myself I'd just gotten turned around, that all I needed was to retrace my steps. But the further I walked, the more I realized I wasn't getting closer to camp. I was getting deeper into the woods. As night fell, I decided to stop and set up a fire where I was. I gathered wood, struck a flame, and tried to calm myself. That was when I heard the first sound. It wasn't an animal. I've spent enough time in the outdoors to tell the difference between a deer, a raccoon, a bear. This was different. It was the sound of something large moving slowly, deliberately through the trees. The firelight flickered, and I sat frozen, staring into the darkness. For a long time, nothing came into view. Then I heard a low, drawn-out whistle. Not a bird, not the wind, a whistle. 3 notes, rising and falling. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire high, every crack of a branch making my heart jump. When the first light of dawn came, I started moving again, desperate to find my camp. But no matter which direction I went, the forest seemed endless. Hours passed. My water ran low, and then I found it. Another camp, but not mine. It was old, tents collapsed and rotting, cooking gear rusted through, a backpack half buried in the dirt. I knelt and pulled it out, brushing away the soil. The fabric tore in my hands, the straps stiff with age. Inside were scraps of clothing, faded photographs, a journal eaten through by mildew. I couldn't make out much. A few words on the damp pages were still legible. It follows us. We can't leave. The woods keep changing. My stomach turned. Whoever had camped here hadn't left willingly. That night, I built another fire, larger than before. I sat with my back against a tree, clutching a stick like a weapon. The whistling came again, closer this time. Then the footsteps. Slow, heavy, circling. I shined my flashlight into the trees and caught a glimpse of something I still can't explain. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its body bent at angles no human body should bend. Its skin was pale, stretched tight, And its face, God, its face looked like bark, rough and scarred, with hollow pits where eyes should have been. It moved just out of reach of the light, pacing, circling. Each time my beam flicked away, it crept closer. I stayed awake until morning, too terrified to move. When dawn came, the figure was gone, but the trees around my fire were marked with fresh carvings. The same runes I'd seen before. Only this time, they formed a circle around me. I ran. I don't even know how long I ran. Hours. Days. Time stopped making sense. My water was gone, my food nearly out, my body shaking from exhaustion. But somehow, by sheer luck or blind instinct, I stumbled onto the logging road again. My truck was still there, covered in a fine layer of dust, as if months had passed. When I finally made it back to town, I went straight to my boss and told him I wouldn't take the job. I quit that day. He thought I was crazy, said I must have gotten lost and panicked. But I know what I saw. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that whistle in my dreams, and I wake up afraid that the woods haven't let me go after all. I've been a long-haul truck driver for almost 15 years, and I've seen more of America's roads at night than most people could ever imagine. For me, the road is home. The hum of the engine, the endless lines of asphalt, the glow of headlights stretching into the dark. I've delivered freight from the deserts of Arizona to the snowy highways of Montana, and I've had my share of odd encounters, stranded motorists, freak weather, even the occasional UFO story from another driver on the CB. But there's one night that will haunt me until the day I die. It happened in late October of 2014. I was hauling a refrigerated trailer full of produce from Texas to Ohio. The run required me to cut through parts of Arkansas and Tennessee on back roads because of construction delays on the interstate. Normally, I hate taking two-lane highways late at night. It's easy to get tired, and there's not much traffic if you run into trouble. But I was behind schedule and didn't have a choice. Around 1:30 in the morning, I was driving through a heavily wooded stretch of highway near the Tennessee border. No other cars in sight, just me, my rig, and the black forest pressing in on both sides. I remember the moon was bright enough that the tree line looked like jagged teeth against the sky. My CB was quiet, my coffee thermos empty, and I was counting down the miles to the next truck stop. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was just a deer on the side of the road, but as I got closer, I realized it was a woman. She was standing barefoot on the shoulder, wearing a thin white dress that looked like it belonged in another century. Her hair was long, tangled, hanging in her face. She didn't move as I approached, just stood there, staring down at the pavement. I slowed down, instinctively gripping the wheel tighter. Out here, at this time of night, there was no reason anyone should be standing alone in the middle of nowhere. My headlights washed over her pale figure, and that's when she suddenly lifted her head. Her face was wrong. Her skin was ashen, stretched too tight across her cheekbones. Her eyes dark pits that reflected the light like glass. And as my rig passed her, she opened her mouth wide, unnaturally wide, and let out a silent scream. My heart slammed in my chest. I pressed harder on the accelerator, refusing to look in my mirrors. I've heard too many stories from fellow truckers. If you see something you can't explain, don't stop. Don't turn around. Just keep driving. I must have gone 5 miles before I started to calm down, convincing myself it was exhaustion playing tricks on me. But then, up ahead in my headlights, I saw her again. The same woman, standing on the side of the road, barefoot, head bowed, waiting. I slammed my brakes so hard the trailer rattled. My stomach dropped. There was no way she could have gotten ahead of me. No car, no sound, just her, waiting like she'd been standing there the whole time. I swerved into the opposite lane and blew past her, my horn blaring. For a second, I saw her face again as I passed, mouth open, black eyes unblinking, and I swear I could feel the temperature in my cab drop. Panic set in. I gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every instinct screamed at me to keep going, but part of me wondered if I'd lost my mind. I checked the clock on my dash. It was stuck at 1:37 a.m. It had been 1:37 since the first time I saw her. The next 20 minutes were a blur. I drove as fast as my rig would allow, the woods blurring past, my chest tight with fear. I tried turning on the radio, flipping through static, trying to hear any voice, anything human. But every station was dead silence. Then it happened again. She was in the road this time, standing right in the center of my lane, arms hanging at her sides. I had no time to stop. I braced myself and plowed forward, but instead of impact, she vanished. 1 second she was there, the next she wasn't. My truck shuddered like it had hit a pothole, and I swore I heard a faint whisper inside my cab. "You can't leave." I nearly lost control. I pulled off onto the shoulder, shaking so badly I could hardly shift gears. My headlights cut across the trees, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, from the woods, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving closer. I locked my doors, grabbed my flashlight, and pressed my back against the seat. The steps circled my cab, crunching leaves, dragging along the metal of the trailer. My flashlight beam trembled as I pointed it toward the window, but I saw nothing. Nothing but the faint outline of handprints, wet, pale handprints, smearing across the glass from the outside. I don't remember how long I sat there, frozen. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. All I know is that eventually, without warning, my radio crackled to life. A man's voice came through the static, sharp and urgent. "Driver, don't stop. Get moving. Now." I didn't think twice. I slammed the truck back into gear and took off down the road. My dash clock flickered, resetting itself, jumping straight to 3:15 a.m. By the time I saw the lights of a small truck stop, I was sobbing with relief. I parked, stumbled inside, and the clerk looked at me like I'd seen a ghost. My hand was shaking so badly, I dropped my wallet on the counter. When I finally made it to Ohio the next day, I didn't tell anyone what happened. I thought maybe it was exhaustion, maybe my mind playing tricks. But when I got back to my truck later, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the outside of the driver's side window, clear as day, were smeared handprints. Too long, too thin, like someone had pressed their face against the glass and dragged their hands down. Since that night, I refuse to take back roads after dark. I stick to the interstates, no matter the delays, no matter the detours. And every October, when the air gets cold and the nights grow long, I can still hear those words echoing in my head. "You can't leave." I grew up in New Jersey, but most of my adult life has been spent traveling between states for contract construction jobs. My work has taken me to places most people wouldn't dare go. Old industrial sites, collapsing barns, forgotten mines. I've always been the kind of person who feels drawn to ruins, the way nature slowly takes back what man once claimed. But nothing in all my years prepared me for what happened inside the abandoned asylum on the outskirts of rural Pennsylvania. It was late autumn when I took that job. The company I worked for had been contracted to inspect a piece of land that once belonged to the state. The site included the remnants of an old psychiatric hospital that had been shut down in the 1970s. Developers wanted to buy the property and tear everything down to put up a residential neighborhood, but first they needed a safety assessment. My boss sent me because I had a reputation for not scaring easily and for documenting everything thoroughly. The asylum sat miles from the nearest town, surrounded by decaying woods. The access road was cracked with weeds, and the iron gate at the front sagged under years of rust. Beyond it stood several looming brick buildings, their windows black and empty like watchful eyes. The air felt colder the moment I stepped out of my truck, like the place exhaled a chill that the sun couldn't touch. I carried my equipment with me: camera, notebook, flashlight, and measuring tape. The first building I entered was the administration hall. Dust coated every surface, and the faint smell of mold clung to the air. My boots crunched on broken plaster as I moved through wide hallways lined with peeling paint. Old filing cabinets stood like tombstones, their drawers hanging open, spilling out yellow papers no one had touched in decades. The silence was absolute, except for the occasional creak of the building settling or the distant flutter of pigeons nesting in the rafters. Still, as I moved deeper, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every corner I turned, I expected to see someone standing at the end of the hall, but there was never anyone there. Only empty corridors stretching into darkness. I documented the structural decay, noting cracked ceilings and warped flooring. Then I moved on to the wards. These were long rooms with rows of iron bed frames bolted to the floor, their mattresses long rotted away. Rust clung to every surface. In some places, the floor tiles had buckled into jagged ridges, like scars. The air was thicker here, heavy with a musty dampness that stung the back of my throat. It was in one of those wards that I found the first strange thing. Against the far wall, in the dust, was a set of footprints. Bare feet. They led from one end of the room to the other, disappearing into the shadows of a side hallway. They were fresh enough that the dust around them hadn't settled back in. I froze, staring, my breath fogging in the dim light. I knew I was alone, or at least I was supposed to be. I told myself it was probably some local kid sneaking in, maybe a squatter, but the prints unsettled me. They were long, narrow, and oddly spaced, as if whoever made them didn't walk quite like a normal person. I followed them, though every instinct screamed out too. The side hallway led me into the treatment wing. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I felt my skin tighten with goosebumps. The rooms here were smaller, many with heavy doors reinforced with iron. I recognized them as isolation cells. Their windows were barred, their walls covered in scratches where desperate hands had clawed at the plaster. Some scratches spelled out words, but most were just frenzied marks that spoke of madness. At the end of the wing, the footprints stopped abruptly in front of a door that hung slightly ajar. The inside was pitch black, but when I shined my flashlight inside, the beam illuminated something that turned my stomach. Chains hung from the ceiling, ending in worn leather restraints. Beneath them was a metal chair bolted to the floor, streaked with rust that might not have been only rust. The walls were covered in faded writing, some in chalk, some carved deep into the surface. I leaned closer to read, and saw the same phrase repeated over and over in uneven scrawls. Never let her out. My hands trembled as I took photographs, though my instincts told me I shouldn't linger. The entire time I was in that room, I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was standing just behind me, leaning close, breathing faintly against my neck. But when I spun around, there was nothing, just the empty hallway. I forced myself to keep going. The asylum had a basement, and though I dreaded descending into it, my job demanded I inspect every structure. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, and the deeper I went, the damper the air became. A foul odor rose to meet me, thick and pungent, like wet earth mixed with rot. The basement was a labyrinth of corridors lined with pipes. Water dripped steadily somewhere in the dark, echoing off the concrete walls. My flashlight beam quivered as I swept it across the space. In the far corner, I saw a row of rusted wheelchairs, their seats shredded, their wheels locked in place by decades of disuse. Behind them, gurneys leaned against the wall like forgotten coffins. I walked further, and that was when I heard it, faint at first, but growing clearer with each step. A dragging sound, slow, deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I froze, listening. The sound stopped when I did, then resumed as I moved forward. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing in the endless dark. My heart pounded. I tried to tell myself it was pipes, shifting metal, a trick of acoustics, but deep down I knew better. I turned a corner and nearly dropped my flashlight. On the floor ahead of me was a trail, dark, with streaks smeared across the concrete, leading into a room with no door. It looked like something, or someone, had been dragged inside. Against my better judgment, I followed the trail. The room was small, its walls lined with shelves stacked with glass jars. Inside the jars floated things I couldn't identify. Cloudy shapes suspended in yellow fluid, some resembling human organs, others too malformed to name. My stomach churned as I shined the light across them. On the floor, directly beneath the shelves, the trail ended in a wide dark stain. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. One of the jars at the back of the shelf was different. Instead of an organ or specimen, it contained a doll. Its face was cracked porcelain, its eyes painted black, its dress waterlogged and rotted. For a moment, I thought it was just a strange relic. Then the head shifted slightly inside the jar, as though it had followed the movement of my flashlight. I stumbled back, slamming into the shelves, nearly knocking the jars over. My breath came fast and shallow. I backed out of the room, refusing to look away, until I reached the hallway again. The dragging sound returned. This time it was closer, louder, echoing directly behind me. I broke into a run, racing through the maze of corridors, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the walls. My boots splashed through shallow puddles, and every time I thought I'd lost the sound, it grew louder again, closing in on me. By the time I reached the stairs, my lungs burned. I didn't dare look behind me. I scrambled upward 2 steps at a time, nearly tripping in my panic. When I burst out into the ground floor, the air felt almost breathable again, though the chill clung to me. I didn't stop until I was outside, gulping fresh air under the gray autumn sky. I left my equipment behind that day. I didn't care. I ran to my truck, started the engine, and didn't stop until I was miles away from that cursed building. For weeks afterward, I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it, that stress and the atmosphere of the asylum had gotten into my head. But I know what I heard, what I saw, what I felt. The dragging sound has followed me into my dreams ever since, echoing through endless halls I can never escape. And sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night, my apartment silent and dark, I swear I hear it again, something heavy being pulled slowly across the floor. My name is David Collins. I grew up in a small town in Kentucky where most kids knew every crack in the sidewalks and every shadow on the roads. My life was ordinary, quiet, and predictable until one night changed everything. That night happened when I was 21, during a summer I'll never forget. In my town, there was a graveyard that had been there since the 1800s. People used to tell stories about it, claiming it was haunted. I never put much stock in those tales, but the graveyard always carried an eerie weight, especially at night. It sat on a hill just outside town, surrounded by tall iron gates that were rusting and twisted in some places. Beyond those gates, rows of crumbling tombstones leaned at odd angles, their inscriptions weathered away by time. A large oak tree grew in the middle of the cemetery, its branches stretching wide like skeletal arms over the graves. One evening, close to midnight, I found myself walking along the road near that graveyard. I had been out late, restless and unable to sleep, and my steps carried me toward that hill as if drawn by some force I couldn't understand. The night was heavy with humidity, the air still and suffocating. Crickets buzzed in the fields, but their rhythm stopped dead when I reached the gate. It was as if even the insects refused to cross that boundary. I stood there, gripping the cold iron bars, staring into the darkness between the stones. My pulse was steady at first, but as I stepped inside, an unnatural chill seemed to wash over me. My skin prickled, and my breath came out in pale puffs despite the thick summer air. I should have turned back, but I didn't. Something compelled me deeper. The gravel path crunched beneath my shoes as I walked past row after row of graves. Many of the stones were broken, tilted into the earth, as if the ground had tried to swallow them whole. The oak tree loomed closer, and beneath it, the shadows seemed darker, denser. My chest grew tighter with each step, but my legs carried me forward against my better judgment. When I reached the center of the graveyard, I noticed the soil beneath the oak tree was freshly disturbed. A patch of earth darker than the rest stretched out in a long mound, as though someone had dug there recently. No flowers, no marker, nothing but raw dirt that smelled damp and metallic. I crouched down, running my fingers across the soil. It was cold, far colder than it should have been. As I stood again, I became aware of a sound behind me. It wasn't the wind, because the night was still. It wasn't footsteps either. It was a low scraping, like fingernails dragging against stone. I froze, my ears straining, and slowly turned my head. At first, I saw nothing but rows of tombstones in the moonlight. Then, one of the stones shifted. It wasn't the ground shaking or a trick of the light. The stone physically tilted forward, grinding against the earth, before slowly sliding back upright. My throat went dry. My first instinct was to tell myself it had been loose. That old stones shifted sometimes. But then another one moved, and another. Within seconds, the sound of scraping filled the graveyard as tombstones tilted and righted themselves, like heads turning in unison. My heart pounded, so hard it hurt. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt nailed to the ground. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. My chest tightened as the sound faded, replaced by silence so absolute it rang in my ears. And then I saw it. From the disturbed soil beneath the oak tree, the ground began to bulge upward. The mound split down the middle as the dirt pushed aside. Slowly, something pale emerged a hand. It was thin, skeletal, its fingers impossibly long, curling into the air as though clawing for release. The soil gave way further as the figure began to pull itself out. Its face surfaced next, skin stretched tight over bone, eyes dark hollows that reflected nothing. Its mouth hung open, jaw slack, revealing rows of broken teeth. I staggered back, my heel catching on a stone. My fall jolted me into action, and I scrambled to my feet, turning to flee. The gravel path that had been clear before was now covered in shadows, thick and writhing as if alive. My legs pumped, carrying me toward the gate. But no matter how far I ran, the distance seemed endless. The rows of graves stretched on, repeating like a nightmare loop. The oak tree loomed again before me, though I had turned away from it. The mound of dirt was open wider now, the figure fully risen, its body towering, gaunt and bent, its head tilted as though it were studying me. And then it began to move, not walking, sliding, gliding across the ground without sound. My lungs burned, my vision blurred, but I forced myself forward, cutting through the gravestones, desperate to break free of the looping maze. Every step seemed to carry me closer to the oak, no matter which direction I ran. My panic grew, clawing at my insides. At last, the gate appeared, rusted bars glinting faintly in the moonlight. I sprinted, my heart clawing at my ribs, every nerve screaming as the figure glided faster behind me. I didn't dare look back. I could feel it closing in, cold air brushing my neck, the scent of rot filling my lungs. When I burst through the gate, the sound stopped. The scraping, the shifting stones, the silence pressing in. It all ceased at once. I collapsed to my knees on the road, gasping for breath, my body shaking uncontrollably. Behind me, the graveyard stood in silence, the oak tree swaying faintly though the air was still. I never went back to that hill. For weeks, I woke in the night drenched in sweat, the smell of damp soil lingering in my nose. Even now, years later, I avoid driving that road after dark. Some nights, though, when the wind is still and the moon is bright, I swear I can hear it. The faint scrape of stones shifting, like the dead are restless and waiting. I was a forest ranger in the Appalachian Mountains for nearly a decade. I spent my life patrolling remote trails, maintaining campsites, and keeping hikers safe. I thought I had seen everything nature had to throw at me. Storms, accidents, even bear encounters. But nothing, not even the worst storms, could have prepared me for what I found in the backcountry of Green Hollow Forest one late October. I had been assigned a solo patrol of a particularly dense section of the forest, miles from the nearest ranger station. The area was notorious for its twisting trails, steep ravines, and thick undergrowth. Locals whispered about disappearances over the years, hikers who never returned, campers who swore they saw figures moving through the trees at night. Of course, I dismissed those stories. I had a job to do, and superstition had no place in it. I set out just before dawn, carrying my standard gear: radio, flashlight, map, first aid kit, and a small supply of food and water. The air was crisp, with a low fog blanketing the ground, and the leaves had begun to turn amber and crimson. As I hiked deeper into the forest, the sounds of birdsong faded, replaced by a heavy silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. By midday, I had covered nearly 5 miles and was approaching a section of the forest that had been off limits for logging crews for decades. The trees were enormous, trunks wide as cars, their roots twisting through the earth like serpents. Moss hung from the branches, and the air was thick with damp, earthy smell. I paused to take notes about fallen trees and unstable ground, unaware that something was observing me. As I moved along a narrow trail, I noticed something odd. The underbrush on either side of the path was trampled in a pattern that suggested someone, or something, had moved through recently. The impression was too deep to be from an animal, too deliberate to be natural. I hesitated, but told myself it was probably a hunter or a lost hiker. Still, I made a mental note to report it. By late afternoon, the sunlight filtering through the dense canopy grew dimmer. The fog thickened, curling around the bases of the trees and shrouding the trail ahead. I realized I had lost my sense of direction. Every landmark looked familiar, yet different, and the map I had brought seemed useless against the constantly shifting shadows. That was when I saw the figure. At first, it appeared as a dark silhouette between the trees. I thought it might be another ranger or a hiker, until I noticed its proportions. It was unnaturally tall, limbs elongated in ways that didn't seem human. Its movements were jerky but deliberate, stepping silently despite the thick layer of leaves underfoot. I stopped in my tracks, holding my breath. The figure did not respond to my presence. It simply stood there watching. The fog swirled around it, masking details, but I could feel its gaze pressing into me. I tried to move quietly in the opposite direction, hoping to put distance between us. But no matter which way I turned, the figure remained in my peripheral vision, always a step ahead, always moving through the trees with impossible speed and silence. The forest began to change. The familiar trail twisted unnaturally, trees appearing where they had not been moments before. Roots seemed to rise out of the ground, tripping me repeatedly. Every time I looked over my shoulder, the figure seemed closer. I couldn't tell if it was stalking me or if the forest itself was shifting, herding me towards something I didn't want to find. I stumbled into a clearing, thinking I might gain a better vantage point. The area was circular, with an ancient stone structure at its center, walls crumbling, covered in moss, and etched with symbols I did not recognize. The figure emerged from the tree lane and stepped into the clearing. Its form was more distinct now, pale gray, with long arms that dragged slightly along the ground, and a face that was smooth and empty where features should have been. I froze, realizing I was trapped. The forest around the clearing had changed entirely. The paths I had used to get here were gone, replaced by dense trees that bent inward like walls. I tried to back away, but the ground itself seemed to resist me, roots twisting to block each step. The figure began to move toward me, gliding silently, its head tilting unnaturally as though studying my reactions. I forced myself to move sideways, keeping my eyes on it, noting the way its shadow shifted oddly in the dim light. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt leaden, my body numb with fear. As the figure closed in, I saw something else, shapes moving in the fog behind it, shadowy, indistinct forms that mimicked its movements. They were taller than trees, yet slender, bending in impossible angles, emerging from a fog and retreating in synchronization with the figure. Panic overwhelmed me. I dropped my flashlight and radio, screaming in my head, not aloud. I forced my legs to move faster, breaking into a run, but the clearing stretched endlessly, the stone structure disappearing behind me, the shadows following. The forest had become a labyrinth, alive with something that did not belong in the natural world. Hours, or maybe minutes later, I stumbled into an old logging road. The fog had lifted, the trees now ordinary and familiar, but my mind refused to accept it. I collapsed, gasping, shaking, and my flashlight rolled to the side, its beam illuminating the footprints of something enormous. They led nowhere, vanishing into the undergrowth. I left Green Hollow Forest that night and never returned. Even in daylight, I avoid its trails. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the figure in the fog, circling silently, its impossible shadows stretching across the forest floor, waiting for the next person to wander too far. And I know it is still there. I have spent most of my life traveling for work, often alone. I've seen many strange and unsettling places, but nothing compares to the experience I had in the fall of 2012, when I rented a small cabin deep in the forests of Vermont for a solo weekend retreat. At first, I thought it would be peaceful, a chance to escape the constant noise of the city. But the cabin and the woods surrounding it had other plans. The cabin was old, built from dark, weathered logs, and tucked into a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. I arrived just as the sun was setting, the light slanting through the trees in orange-gold streaks. The air smelled of damp leaves and pine, and the only sound was the whisper of wind through the branches. Inside, the cabin was simple. A main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a loft for sleeping. It had electricity, but no internet, which I considered a benefit. I spent the first evening exploring the surrounding woods, following narrow trails that led past moss-covered rocks and small creeks. The silence was comforting at first, broken only by the occasional call of an owl or the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But as darkness fell, the forest began to feel oppressive, as if the trees themselves were leaning in to watch. That night, I lit a fire and tried to ignore the feeling of being observed. I cooked a simple meal, then climbed into the loft to sleep. Around midnight, I woke to a faint sound, something scraping against the side of the cabin. I froze, listening. The noise repeated, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging something across wood. I checked the windows. Nothing, just the blackness of the forest beyond. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer brushing against the logs. But the sound continued for hours, rhythmic, deliberate, and growing closer. By 3 a.m., I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The moon had risen high, casting a silver glow on the clearing. The trees seemed closer than before, their shadows stretching unnaturally toward the cabin. I shined my light into the forest, but saw nothing, only the long shadows of the trees and the fog beginning to curl along the ground. The scraping sound stopped. For a moment, there was silence so absolute it pressed against my ears. Then I noticed footprints in the dirt around the cabin, barefoot, long and narrow, leading from the edge of the woods to the cabin and back again. Fresh. Fear gnawed at me, but I couldn't leave. My truck was parked a mile down the trail, and the idea of navigating that forest at night, with whatever had been walking outside, seemed impossible. I stayed inside, locked the doors, and tried to stay awake until dawn. Morning didn't bring relief. The forest outside looked normal in the daylight, but the sense of unease remained. I decided to investigate. Following the footprints into the trees, I found a narrow path that hadn't been visible the day before. It led deeper into the woods, past old stone foundations of cabins long forgotten. The trail wound endlessly, as if the forest itself was shifting, rearranging to keep me inside. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, and the shadows shifted, but the forest never seemed to end. Every creek, every rock, every fallen log looked familiar yet different. Then I saw the first figure. It stood between the trees, pale and tall, limbs too long, bent at impossible angles. Its head swiveled slowly, watching me without moving its body forward. I froze, heart hammering, breath catching my throat. The figure didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence pressing down on me. I turned to leave, but the path behind me had vanished. The forest had rearranged. Panic surged. I ran blindly, crashing through underbrush, tripping over roots, cutting my arms and legs on brambles. The figure followed silently, keeping just at the edge of my vision, circling me with a patience that made my skin crawl. Hours, or maybe it was minutes, later, I stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood another cabin, older than mine, crumbling, with windows blacked out and the door hanging loose on its hinges. As I approached, I noticed the ground around it was scarred with strange symbols carved into the earth, filled with ash or dirt. I recognized the shapes vaguely, from old books, symbols meant to bind, to trap. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with rot. The walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges that formed no pattern I could recognize. In the center of the floor lay a circle of objects, animal bones, shards of glass, burned wood. My flashlight flickered. I stepped back, and the door slammed shut behind me. The temperature dropped. My breath came out in thick clouds. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor, forming shapes that didn't belong. The figure appeared at the edge of the circle, its limbs unnaturally long, its face a hollow void. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I backed against the wall, every nerve screaming for me to escape. Suddenly, the shadows surged. They twisted, growing taller, denser, surrounding me. The figure advanced, moving without sound, gliding across the floor. My mind raced, realizing that I had been drawn here, trapped by something in the woods. The air grew thick, heavy, and my vision blurred. I woke hours later outside my own cabin, lying on the ground, covered in leaves and mud. The sun was high. My truck was untouched, my gear in place. For weeks afterward, I avoided the forest. The cabin rental was canceled permanently. I returned to the city and tried to forget, but the memory never left. Even now, years later, I still see shadows moving in the corner of my eye. Even now, I still hear scraping against wood in the quiet of my apartment. The forest never let me go. It waits. It always waits. My name is Eric Thompson. I've been a truck driver for nearly a decade, hauling everything from refrigerated produce to heavy machinery. I've driven through deserts, mountains, swamps, and countless miles of empty highways at night. Usually, I can handle isolation and the monotony of the road, but one night on a remote stretch of highway in West Virginia changed the way I view empty roads forever. It was early November, late at night, and I was driving southbound on Route 33. The fog had rolled in thick and heavy, clinging to the ground, reducing visibility to less than 100 feet. I'd been on the road for nearly 10 hours and was approaching the point where the trees of the Appalachian foothills pressed close to the asphalt, creating long shadows in the dim glow of my headlights. The highway was deserted, save for a few reflective markers guiding my way. That's when I saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road, just past a curve. At first, I thought it might be a hitchhiker, though I rarely see anyone at that hour. As I approached, the figure didn't move, didn't wave or call out. It simply stood there, motionless, almost too still. I slowed down, curiosity mixed with a sense of unease. It was a man, or at least human in shape, but far too tall, unnaturally thin, and dressed in dark, tattered clothing that seemed to swallow him into the night. His head was tilted slightly forward, the face obscured by shadows. As I passed, I noticed his eyes, dark, reflective, like polished black stones, and a sudden shiver ran down my spine. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just exhaustion and fog playing tricks on my mind. But a few miles down the road, I noticed him again. Same spot. No, closer this time, standing by a tree just off the shoulder. I slammed on the brakes, my tires squealing on the wet pavement, and my headlights cut through the fog. But he was gone. I pressed forward, my pulse racing, insisting to myself that I had imagined it. Hours passed in tense silence. Then, at the next bend, I saw him again, on the road, directly in front of me. I swerved violently, barely avoiding him, my rig fishtailing slightly. The figure remained unmoving, watching, as though daring me to hit him. Panic took hold. I accelerated, trying to put distance between us, but every time I looked in my mirrors, he appeared again, sometimes on the shoulder, sometimes behind my cab, sometimes standing silently in the middle of the lane. There was no pattern, no logic, just him, stalking, moving faster than any human should. The fog grew thicker, almost suffocating, and the edges of the highway seemed to distort. Trees leaned inward, shadows twisted unnaturally, and the world around me felt wrong. My heart pounded. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I didn't dare stop. Hours, or maybe it was minutes, later, I came across an abandoned rest stop. Lights flickered weakly inside, and I pulled over, desperate for a moment to collect myself. I ran inside, slamming the door behind me, and caught my breath. The air was stale, dusty, filled with the scent of rot. No one was there. I checked the rest stop grounds through the windows. Nothing. But when I looked back at my truck through the glass, I saw footprints, bare, elongated, leading from the highway to the door and disappearing into the trees. I couldn't make sense of it. I wanted to leave, to get back on the highway and put distance between me and whatever was out there, but my instincts screamed to stay inside. Hours passed. I watched the road, expecting him to appear, expecting him to come closer. The fog shifted, thickening in patches, moving unnaturally across the asphalt. I couldn't eat, couldn't drink, couldn't rest. Every sound made me flinch. The scrape of metal, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a car I couldn't see. By dawn, the fog lifted. I cautiously stepped outside, every muscle trembling. The footprints were gone. The highway looked normal, the trees ordinary. I got back into my rig, hesitant, but needing to escape. I didn't see him again. Not on that road. Not on any route I've driven since. But the memory lingers. At night, when the fog rolls in thick on deserted highways, I still see his shape in the corner of my vision. I still hear the faint scrape of shoes on asphalt. And I know that somewhere out there, waiting in the shadows of empty roads, he watches. I had been planning a solo weekend getaway to a secluded lake cabin in northern Michigan for months. I wanted nothing more than to escape the constant hum of the city, the endless emails, and the stress of work. The cabin was small, rustic, and sat on the edge of a lake surrounded by dense pine and birch forests. The advertisement promised peace, solitude, and clear water. What it didn't mention was what waited in those woods. I arrived late Friday afternoon, just as the sun was sinking below the horizon. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a loon. The cabin itself was charming, though worn with age. Inside, it had a small fireplace, a kitchen with barely functioning appliances, and a loft with a single bed. I unpacked quickly, eager to start my weekend, and spent the first hour exploring the area near the lake. As darkness fell, the lake took on a black, glassy surface, reflecting the thin crescent moon. The air was thick and smelled of damp earth and pine. I built a fire in the cabin's stone hearth, trying to shake off an uneasy feeling that had settled over me. Something about the way the trees loomed so close to the cabin, their branches scratching faintly against the roof, made the hair on my neck rise. Around midnight, I was awoken by a faint sound outside, a soft, deliberate tapping on the cabin walls. I froze, listening. The wind was still, the lake silent, yet the tapping continued. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, sweeping the beam across the clearing. Nothing moved. The trees swayed lightly, but there was no one there. I returned inside, telling myself it was an animal, a branch brushing against the logs. But the feeling of being watched did not fade. It grew heavier with every passing minute, pressing against my chest. Every time I glanced toward the tree line, shadows seemed to move just beyond the light, fleeting shapes I could never quite catch. The next morning, I decided to explore the far side of the lake. The trail was narrow, overgrown, and twisted through the forest, but I followed it anyway. Hours passed as I trudged through thick underbrush, the forest growing darker and colder despite the rising sun. I began to notice markings on trees, scratches in bark, crude symbols etched deep, some resembling eyes. The ground seemed uneven, as if something had shifted it deliberately. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had wandered far from the cabin. The lake was nowhere in sight, and the trail I had followed had disappeared. The forest had closed in, trees leaning inward, creating a tunnel of shadows. Panic started to creep in as I realized the area looked unfamiliar. Even the path back seemed altered, as though the forest itself was reshaping. I kept moving, hoping to find the water or my cabin. That's when I saw them, figures standing among the trees. Not human exactly, though their shapes were vaguely humanoid. They were tall, thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Their skin was pale gray, blending with the mist, and their faces were featureless except for dark pits where eyes should have been. I froze, hoping they hadn't seen me. The figures didn't move, but the air around me grew colder, heavier, like the forest was breathing down my neck. When I tried to turn, the trail I had followed was gone entirely. The forest had shifted again. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed as I ran blindly through the woods. My energy waned, and my breath came in ragged gasps. The figure seemed to move subtly, staying just at the edge of my vision, circling me, guiding me deeper into the trees. Every step I took felt like I was walking in place. By nightfall, I stumbled into a clearing with an old boathouse on stilts above the lake. Its boards were rotten, swaying gently in the breeze. I approached cautiously, desperate for any sign of safety. The lake reflected the moonlight, but something felt off. The water shimmered strangely, dark ripples moving across its surface as though something beneath stirred. Then the figures emerged from the forest, surrounding the clearing. They didn't make a sound, but their presence was oppressive, pressing on me from every side. My mind screamed to run, but every direction led me back to the water's edge. My flashlight flickered and died. The forest and the lake merged into darkness, swallowing me whole. When I awoke, I was inside the cabin, lying on the floor. Morning light filtered through the windows. My clothes were wet and torn, leaves stuck to my skin. I looked outside. The lake was calm, the forest seemingly ordinary, but the scratches on the trees near the cabin were new, deep and fresh. I never returned to that lake. I never spoke of what happened. Even now, years later, when I see a forested lake in the distance, I feel the weight of those figures watching from the shadows, waiting for the next person to wander too far from safety. I worked as a freelance photographer for outdoor magazines, and part of my job involved exploring remote mountain ranges for stunning landscapes. I'd spent months planning a solo expedition into the Allegheny Mountains in West Virginia to capture early autumn colors from a trail that few hikers dared to traverse. I thought I was prepared for the physical challenges, the cold nights, and the isolation. I was not prepared for what the mountains had in store. I arrived at the trailhead just before dawn. The mist clung to the trees, curling around the roots and rocks like living tendrils. The path was narrow, bordered by steep drop-offs on one side and dense forest on the other. The air was crisp and smelled of wet leaves and pine sap. I loaded my pack and began hiking, my camera slung across my chest, my mind focused on the light that would soon filter through the canopy. The first few hours were uneventful. The forest was alive with birdsong, the occasional rustle of squirrels, and the sound of my own boots crunching along the leaf-strewn path. But as I climbed higher, the trees grew denser, and a heavy silence replaced the usual forest sounds. Even the wind seemed to vanish, leaving a stillness that pressed against my ears. By midday, I reached a small clearing that offered a view of a valley below, bathed in gold and crimson. I paused to take photographs, but even as I framed my shots, I felt it, a presence, subtle at first, like someone watching from the shadows of the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination. I had been alone in the wilderness many times before. As I continued up the trail, I noticed subtle changes. The path seemed narrower, the trees closer, and shadows deeper. Occasionally, I glimpsed something moving just beyond my vision, something tall and thin, bending in ways that no human body could. Each time I turned to look directly, nothing was there. By late afternoon, I realized I had passed a marker I remembered from the trail map. The trail I thought I was following had vanished. Every bend in the path looked identical to the one before, twisted branches and roots forming a confusing maze. I tried to backtrack, but the forest seemed to shift with each step. Roots that hadn't been there the first time appeared to trip me. Boulders seemed to move just enough to block my way. The sun began to sink behind the mountains, casting long, black shadows across the forest floor. That was when I saw it, a figure emerging from mist. At first, it looked like a man, standing near a large oak, but its proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, hands brushing the ground. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, and its skin was pale gray, blending almost seamlessly with the fog. I froze. The figure didn't move toward me, didn't make a sound. It simply watched, its head rotating slowly as though studying me. Panic began to bubble in my chest, and I forced myself to move, taking careful steps backward. But no matter how far I walked, the figure remained at the same distance, maintaining a perfect, silent vigil. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time became meaningless. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly, looping back on itself. Every time I thought I recognized a landmark, it was subtly different. Rocks were in different positions. Fallen logs were gone or in new locations. The forest was no longer static. It had become a living labyrinth, reshaping itself around me. Night fell, and with it, a thick fog descended, curling around my legs and obscuring the trail. I was disoriented, exhausted, and my phone had lost signal. My flashlight beam struggled against the mist, illuminating only a few feet ahead. That's when I noticed more figures, tall, thin, emerging from the fog. Some bent at grotesque angles, some hovered slightly above the ground. Their faces were featureless, smooth, except for dark pits where eyes should have been. I stumbled backward, my camera falling from my neck. The figures did not approach directly, but they moved with the forest, hurting me subtly, guiding me toward a small ravine that I had not noticed before. My instincts screamed to flee, but every step I took seemed preordained, as if the forest itself conspired to lead me into their presence. The fog thickened further, and the air grew cold, biting at my skin. My breath came in white clouds. I could hear faint sounds, scraping, whispers that seemed to echo in the fog, though no wind stirred. Panic consumed me. I ran blindly, crashing through underbrush, cutting my arms and face on branches, trying desperately to find any familiar trail. I finally broke through the trees into a small clearing illuminated by the pale moon. In the center stood a stone altar, worn and cracked, with strange carvings etched deep into its surface. The figures had gathered around it, silent, unmoving, their heads tilting toward me in unison. A dark energy seemed to radiate from the altar, pressing against my mind and chest. I could not move. My legs refused to carry me, my muscles locked. The figures slowly advanced, their long limbs gliding over the forest floor without sound. I tried to shout, to run, to do anything, but my voice was trapped in my throat. The cold pressed inward, and the fog thickened into a suffocating wall around me. Then, abruptly, I awoke. I was lying on the trail near the trailhead, morning light filtering through the trees. My camera was beside me, intact but wet with dew. The forest looked normal, ordinary, and peaceful. I forced myself to believe it had been a dream, a hallucination caused by exhaustion and isolation. But when I reviewed the photographs I had taken the previous day, I noticed subtle anomalies, shadows that twisted unnaturally, shapes just beyond the trees that weren't there in real life. And in the final shot, taken from the clearing near the valley, I saw them tall, gray figures with featureless faces, standing along the trail, watching me, their heads tilting impossibly. I never returned to that mountain trail. I avoid hiking alone, avoid remote forests. But even now in the city, I feel the presence of those figures in the quiet moments, in shadows that twist too sharply in foggy mornings. And I know that somewhere in those mountains they wait, patient, silent, and eternal. I had always been drawn to abandoned places, fascinated by their history and the stories left behind in their walls. But my fascination turned into terror one winter when I decided to explore the long-abandoned Westbrook Hospital on the outskirts of Ohio. The hospital had been closed for decades, a crumbling structure that locals whispered about but never approached after dark. I thought it would be another ordinary exploration. I was very wrong. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun began to sink behind the leafless trees surrounding the property. The hospital sat on a small hill, its brick walls weathered and cracked, windows broken or boarded up. Snow covered the ground, muffling the crunch of my boots as I approached the main entrance. A thick iron gate had been ripped from its hinges long ago, leaving the property completely open to anyone daring enough to enter. Inside, the hospital smelled of decay and damp plaster. Dust covered every surface, and the dim light from the broken windows barely illuminated the corridors. My flashlight cut a narrow path through the darkness, revealing peeling paint, overturned chairs, and long-abandoned medical equipment. The silence was heavy, pressing against me like a living thing. I moved through the first floor, documenting everything with my camera. Patient records, yellowed with age, littered the floor, some still bearing names and dates. Old gurneys were stacked in corners, their wheels rusted and stuck. It was eerie, yes, but nothing I hadn't seen before. It was on the second floor that things began to change. The air grew colder, the shadows longer and more oppressive. The corridor stretched endlessly, twisting in ways that didn't match the building's layout. My flashlight flickered as I passed rooms where the walls were covered with scratches, deep and frantic, some forming shapes I couldn't understand. As I moved deeper, I found a long ward. Rusted beds lined the walls, the sheets rotted away long ago. I noticed faint footprints in the dust, bare and small, leading down the center of the room and into the hallway beyond. I froze, certain that no one else had been in the hospital for decades. I followed the footprints, my heart pounding. They led to the end of the hall, where a heavy door hung slightly ajar. Beyond it was darkness, so complete it seemed to swallow my flashlight's beam. I hesitated but pushed the door open, revealing a stairwell that descended into the basement. The air smelled stronger here, sour, metallic, and wet. My breath came in ragged gasps as I slowly made my way down. The basement was vast, more extensive than I had expected. Broken pipes hung from the ceiling, dripping cold water onto the concrete floor. Old medical carts and rusted wheelchairs littered the space. As I moved deeper, I heard something, a faint dragging sound, deliberate and slow, echoing through the empty corridors. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped when I stopped moving, then resumed as I stepped forward. My flashlight flickered, revealing a shadow in the corner. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but the shadow shifted, stretching unnaturally, elongating toward me. Panic surged through me, but curiosity held me in place. I followed the sound to a room at the far end of the basement. The door was off its hinges, lying on the floor. Inside, I saw them, bodies long dead, arranged in rows, their skin pale and stretched, faces frozen in terror. Some were missing eyes, some mouths, their limbs twisted at impossible angles. My stomach churned, but I couldn't look away. Then I saw movement. A figure rose slowly from the floor, its form skeletal, skin gray and tight over bone, eyes hollow black pits. It tilted its head toward me, and I felt its gaze pierce my mind. The dragging sound began again, louder this time, echoing through the basement as more figures emerged from the shadows, all pale, all watching. I stumbled backward, falling over a rusted gurney. My flashlight skittered across the floor, illuminating more bodies, some sitting upright, some crawling toward me with unnatural speed. The air grew thick, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I ran, blindly navigating the basement corridors, the dragging sound behind me constant, relentless. Doors that had been closed were now open. Walls seemed to shift, trapping me in a labyrinth of decay. My boots slipped on wet concrete as figures closed in, gliding silently over the floor, their heads tilting, watching, studying me. Hours, or maybe minutes later, I stumbled into a small room with a broken window. Moonlight spilled through, illuminating a way out. I climbed through the glass, cutting my arms, but refusing to stop. I ran into the snow-covered yard, the cold biting through my clothes, my lungs burning. Behind me, the hospital was silent, seemingly abandoned, but I could feel the gaze of those figures, following me even after I had put hundreds of feet between us. I never returned to Westbrook Hospital. I never even mentioned it to friends or family. But at night in my apartment, I sometimes see shadows moving in the corners of my vision, and I hear faint dragging sounds beneath the floorboards. I know what I saw was real. I know those figures are still there, waiting in the dark, patient, silent, eternal. Even now, years later, I avoid abandoned buildings. I avoid the night, and I know that somewhere Westbrook Hospital waits, filled with shadows that will never rest. My name is Jonathan Hale, and I have always been drawn to places that exist on the edge of maps. Villages abandoned for reasons lost to time, towns locals swear they've never seen, and hamlets whose names appear only in faded documents. It was during a research trip for a travel magazine that I found myself chasing rumors of one such place, a village hidden deep in the Appalachian mountains called Havenwood. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, their voices wary, eyes darting toward the forests as they whispered warnings. Don't go there after dark. Don't stay too long. Don't look too closely. Curiosity is both a gift and a curse, and I ignored every warning. I had to see it for myself. I drove for hours along winding mountain roads, following directions pieced together from old maps and whispered instructions from a few hesitant townsfolk. The further I went, the narrower the roads became, until asphalt gave way to gravel and gravel to dirt paths flanked by towering pines. Fog hung heavy in the valleys, curling around the mountains like a living thing. I arrived at dusk, just as the sun bled red behind the peaks. Havenwood appeared suddenly, as if it had been waiting for me. The village was smaller than I imagined, a cluster of wooden houses, barns, and a single stone church. Everything looked frozen in time. The paint on the walls faded but intact. Windows clear yet strangely reflective, and gardens untended but lush in their decay. Birds did not fly, and no animal stirred, yet the air was filled with the scent of baked bread and burning wood, as though the village were alive. The first thing I noticed was silence. Not the ordinary silence of an empty town, but a weighty, expectant silence, as if the entire village were holding its breath. I wandered the streets cautiously, my camera hanging from my neck, documenting the place. Every house I passed was pristine on the outside, but empty inside. Tables were set, cups on saucers, a faint film of dust betraying the absence of life, yet it felt freshly inhabited. Hours passed as I explored, and the sun finally set. That's when I first saw them. Figures, people, walking along the streets. At first, I thought my eyes were deceiving me. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, Victorian era in style, though some wore garments I could not place in time. Their movements were slow, deliberate, almost mechanical. They did not acknowledge me, did not look at me, and yet I could feel their gaze in my mind, cold and penetrating. I approached one of the figures, stepping onto the cobblestone street, and called out. No response. Its head tilted unnaturally, and it glided forward, leaving the street beneath it untouched. My heart raced. Something about it was wrong, too still, too perfect, as though it were a statue animated by something unseen. I turned back to the main street, and the village had changed. Houses I had passed were now gone, replaced by identical structures I did not recognize. The streets twisted, bending in impossible ways, looping back on themselves. My compass spun wildly useless. The fog thickened, curling around me, muting sound, swallowing the world. Then the whispers began, not out loud, but inside my head. Hints of voices, fragmented sentences, memories that were not mine. Leave. Stay. Watch. 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 I stumbled, disoriented, falling into the dust of the street. When I looked up, the figures had multiplied. Hundreds of them, encircling me, their movements synchronized, tilting their heads in unison. I ran. I ran blindly through streets that should have been familiar, but were constantly shifting. Every house I passed was a mirror of the last, yet subtly wrong. Doors too tall, windows too narrow, bricks misaligned. Shapes moved in the fog at the edge of my vision, twisting, elongating, vanishing when I looked directly. The village itself seemed alive, reshaping itself, trapping me in its labyrinth. Hours or days blurred together. Time had no meaning. I discovered a central square dominated by the stone church. Its doors were open, the interior lit by flickering candlelight, despite no candles being present. Inside, the pews were filled with figures, all staring at me, heads tilting in perfect unison. I felt my mind weaken, thoughts unraveling. Every memory I had, every identity I held, felt as though it was slipping away. Then I noticed something astonishing. One figure among the congregation moved differently. It was me, or rather, a version of me. Its face was my own, but twisted, elongated, eyes black pits. It raised a hand, pointing at me. My heart stopped. The whispering grew louder, all inside my head. Overlapping voices repeating, echoing, demanding join us. Become one. Become nothing. I fled the church and ran toward what I thought was the edge of the village. The streets seemed endless, and the fog thickened until I could barely see my own hands. The figures followed silently, circling, never directly touching, but their presence crushed my chest. I stumbled into a house, door slamming shut behind me. Inside, I saw walls lined with mirrors, dozens of them, reflecting versions of myself, each one more distorted than the last. Some screamed, some twisted, some simply stared with empty eyes. Panic overwhelmed me. I smashed a mirror with my flashlight, and the reflections fractured into thousands of shards, each one whispering, screaming, showing places I had never been and faces I did not recognize. A shadow fell across me, and the last thing I saw before losing consciousness was the figure of myself stepping out of a mirror, tilting its head, reaching for me. I woke on the main road outside Havenwood, the sun just beginning to rise. My camera lay beside me, and I was alone, or so it seemed. For weeks afterward, I tried to reconcile what I had seen. My notes and photographs were all corrupted, blank screens, empty pages. No record of Havenwood existed outside my own memory. When I asked locals, they insisted the village had never existed, and maps confirmed it. But I know the truth. I know what I saw. Havenwood is not abandoned. It is waiting. It reshapes itself, hunting, feeding, absorbing. And somewhere inside, the version of me I saw in the mirrors, the one with black eyes and twisted face, still exists, waiting for me to return, waiting for me to forget, waiting for the next curious traveler who ignores the warnings. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can hear the whispers, see the endless streets, the tilting heads, the reflections of myself in mirrors that should not exist. I do not sleep well, and I avoid forests, mountains, and small towns. But sometimes, when I drive late at night through fog-covered roads, I swear I can see the faint outline of a village in the distance, and I know that if I approach, I will vanish, just as I almost did in Havenwood. Some places are not meant to be found. Some horrors are patient, waiting for curiosity to lead them new prey, and Havenwood waits. I never thought that a simple move to a new city could change my life forever. My name is Claire Thompson. I am 26 years old, and I had just landed a new job in Portland, Oregon. The city seemed lively but peaceful, far away from the small town where I grew up in Ohio. I was excited, eager to start fresh, and determined to leave the shadows of my past behind. I rented a small studio apartment in a quiet neighborhood. The building was old but well kept, with brick walls and ivy crawling up the sides. My apartment was on the second floor, overlooking a narrow street lined with maple trees. The sunlight during the day made the room warm and inviting, and at night, the streetlights cast long, soft shadows that made the area feel safe, or so I thought. It all began a week after I moved in. I noticed small things at first, things I tried to ignore, thinking I was imagining them because I was still adjusting. My mail would sometimes be slightly moved from its usual place, even though I always left it neatly stacked. Occasionally, I would find a small note on the kitchen counter with no words, just a single black dot or a strange symbol. I assumed it was some child in the building playing pranks, or maybe the cleaning service I hired had a weird sense of humor. I didn't think much of it, but a small pit in my stomach told me to be cautious. One evening, around 7 o'clock, I returned from work and felt an unusual unease. I had a clear routine. I parked in the same spot on the lot, locked my car, and walked briskly up the steps. That night, however, I noticed that my apartment door, which I always double-locked, was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, stepped in cautiously, and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. My laptop, my clothes, my books, everything was exactly where I had left it. Still, I could not shake the feeling that someone had been there, someone who had waited for me to leave. I didn't call the police that night. I convinced myself it was a neighbor or a building maintenance worker, though even then, I knew it was more sinister. The following days grew worse. I started noticing shadows in the hallways when I returned home. At first, it was fleeting, just a dark shape disappearing behind a corner. But soon, it became consistent. I would see a man standing by the mailboxes, never close enough to confront me, always far enough to vanish when I approached. He was tall, wore a dark hoodie, and his face was obscured, but I could feel his eyes on me. My heart would pound whenever I saw him, my palms sweaty, my thoughts spinning. I started changing my schedule, leaving my apartment at different times, taking longer routes to work. But no matter what I did, I always felt him watching. I started noticing other things, things I could not ignore. My curtains would be slightly shifted, as if someone had peeked inside. My laptop would be open with documents I had not touched, and sometimes files would disappear. I installed security cameras outside my apartment window, but even when I reviewed the footage, nothing appeared unusual. It was as if he was always just out of view, present but invisible. One night, about 3 weeks after moving in, I returned home late, exhausted from work. The streets were empty, and a light rain was falling. As I approached my building, I saw him again, standing under the streetlight across the street, perfectly still. The rain ran down his hoodie, but he did not move. I froze. My keys trembled in my hand. For the first time, I realized this was not random, not a coincidence. He knew my routines, and he had been waiting, watching, planning. I entered my apartment and locked the door, shaking uncontrollably. Sleep did not come that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining what he might do next. The next morning, I woke to find a small package slipped under my door. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside was a single photograph of me, taken in the dark, leaving my apartment the previous night. I had no idea how he had done it, but the image was crystal clear. I could see the fear in my own eyes. There was no message, no signature, nothing but me, caught in the lens of his obsession. That was the moment I realized this was no ordinary stalker. This person knew me, studied me, and he was growing bolder by the day. I immediately contacted the police. I showed them the photograph and explained everything. The notes, the shadows, the slight movements of my belongings. They were sympathetic, but said there was little they could do without more evidence. They recommended changing my locks, installing cameras, and being cautious. I did all of that, but the fear never left me. I moved furniture, changed my routines, and still, every night, I felt watched. The stalker escalated. He began leaving items in my mailbox, old receipts, pieces of thread, and even small objects from my own apartment, things I never remember taking out. Once, I found a single black feather lying on my pillow. I realized then that this person had been inside my apartment, touching my things, knowing every corner of my home. I felt violated, trapped, and helpless. I started carrying pepper spray and installed a small alarm system, but each day, the dread grew heavier. I could not eat, could not sleep, could not focus on work. Every mirror, every reflection, every shadow made me jump, imagining him standing behind me. Weeks turned into months. I became obsessed with finding out who he was. I would sit by my window for hours, watching the street, taking photographs, trying to catch him in the act. Then, one day, I saw him placing something in the bushes near my apartment. I grabbed my camera, ran outside, and took a picture. The flash caught his face briefly, a thin, pale man with sharp features and hollow eyes. He turned and ran before I could react. That photograph was the first concrete evidence I had. I gave it to the police, and this time, they took the case more seriously. Still, the harassment did not stop. I moved temporarily to a friend's apartment for safety, but even there, I felt the presence of someone watching. I started receiving letters in the mail, written in careful, neat handwriting, describing my day as if he had been following me constantly. He knew when I went to the grocery store, when I visited the park, when I left my friend's house. The letters became more personal, more invasive, more threatening. I realized he was no longer just observing. I was now part of his world, and he was obsessed in a way I could not comprehend. The breaking point came one night when I returned to my apartment after being away for a week. I found the front door wide open. Every lock, every chain had been tampered with. Inside, my apartment was completely rearranged. Notes, photographs, and objects were scattered across the floor in a disturbing pattern. In the center of the room, I found a mirror standing upright with a message written on the glass in lipstick. I see you. I did not know how long he had been inside, how long he had touched my things, or how close he had been to me. I barely escaped, collapsing outside in the hallway. calling the police as my shaking hands held the phone. That night, I finally understood that my stalker had been living parallel to my life, existing in the shadows I could never reach. I moved out of Portland shortly after, cutting all ties with that apartment and that city. I changed my phone number, my email, and even my routines. I thought I had escaped, but the fear stayed with me. Even now, years later, I cannot enter an apartment building without checking corners, watching shadows, and imagining eyes staring at me from across the street. I live cautiously, always aware, always alert. Some nights, when I am alone, I swear I can hear footsteps following me down the street, and I know that somewhere, someone is still out there, watching, waiting, patient and silent. I have never stopped thinking about him. The man in the dark hoodie, the hollow-eyed stalker who studied me, invaded my life, and changed me forever. Even now, I wonder if he is still out there, learning about someone new, preparing his next obsession, and I shiver at the thought that the shadow of that fear could touch anyone at any time. My name is Alex, and this is the story of the night I will never forget. I live in a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind of town where everyone knows each other's business, and nothing much ever happens. My parents are both nurses, and they often work night shifts, sometimes leaving me alone in our old two-story house on the edge of town. That night was one of those nights. It was late October. The air was already cold, and the wind had a strange, whistling quality that night. The kind of wind that makes the trees sound like they are whispering secrets. I had just turned 18 a few weeks before, and my parents trusted me to stay home alone. I wasn't supposed to have friends over, and I made sure the doors were locked before they left. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater, and for a while, it felt peaceful. I spent my evening the way I usually do when I am alone, watching a late-night movie in the living room. The lights dimmed, wrapped in a blanket. Around 11:30 p.m., I noticed that something felt off. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker than usual. I tried to shake the feeling. Maybe it was just the wind outside or the way the trees scratched against the windows. But then I saw it. From the corner of my eye, a dark shape moved across the hallway. I froze. I reminded myself I was alone. I checked the house carefully, walking from room to room, but there was nothing. Everything was exactly as it should be. I went back to the living room and tried to continue the movie, but I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking at the staircase that led to the second floor, imagining someone just standing there, looking at me. My heart was beating fast. I told myself it was just my imagination, but a part of me did not believe that. About an hour later, I heard the sound of the back door opening. I knew I had locked it, and I had not left it unlocked. I quietly crept to the kitchen. The back door was slightly ajar. My stomach sank. Someone was in my house. I quickly ran to the utility room and grabbed the kitchen knife. My mind raced. Should I call 911? Should I hide upstairs? I decided to stay on the first floor, hoping the person had not seen me yet. I moved carefully, every step slow, trying not to make a sound. I could hear the floorboards creak under their weight. Whoever it was, they were walking slowly, like they were enjoying it. My body was shaking uncontrollably. I wanted to run, but I knew running would only give away my position. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the kitchen floor, there were muddy footprints, wet and messy, leading from the back door into the house. I had no idea how long they had been there, but they were fresh. The smell of wet earth mixed with something else, something metallic. I realized with horror that it was blood. I backed away slowly, trying to remember everything my parents had taught me about staying calm during emergencies. My phone was on the counter, but I was afraid to reach for it. I didn't want to make any noise that could alert the intruder. Then the lights in the living room flickered. I froze. It was just a normal flicker, but to me, it felt like a warning. I looked at the hallway leading to the living room, and I saw it again. a shadow moving slowly across the wall. I realized then that this was not just a burglar. This was someone who wanted to scare me. Someone who knew I was alone. I could feel their presence in the air, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. I could almost hear their breathing, though the house was otherwise silent. I decided I had to move. I backed into the pantry, locking myself in as quietly as possible. I crouched on the floor, knife in hand, listening. Every second felt like an hour. The footsteps came closer, then stopped. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. I could hear them moving around the living room, opening cabinets, touching things, but they never came into the kitchen. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours. I had no sense of time. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, making the house feel even colder. I could hear whispers, faint, almost like someone was calling my name, but I convinced myself it was just the wind. Finally, as the first light of dawn started to creep through the windows, the intruder left. I don't know why. Maybe they realized I was too careful, or maybe they just wanted to terrify me. I waited until I was sure they were gone, then ran to the neighbor's house and called my parents. They came home immediately, and the police arrived shortly after. They found no one, no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry other than the slightly open back door. It was as if the intruder had vanished into thin air. The experience left me terrified of being alone, of the shadows in my house, of every creak and whisper. I never felt completely safe in my own home again. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear someone walking silently through the house, watching, waiting. I learned that night that fear is not always logical. Sometimes it is simply real. After that first terrifying sight of the muddy footprints, I thought the worst was over. I convinced myself the intruder had already gone, but deep down I knew better. Something in the air felt wrong, thick, heavy, almost like the house itself was holding its breath. I decided I needed to check the rest of the house. I crept toward the living room, knife in hand, moving slowly, trying to stay calm. Every shadow seemed alive. The couch, coffee table, the curtains, they all looked like they were hiding something. As I walked past the hallway to the stairs, I felt a sudden chill on my neck, like someone had just breathed on me. I spun around, but there was nothing. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst. I reached the staircase, and as I started to climb, I heard a soft thud from the second floor, like a heavy object falling. My mind raced. I froze on the stairs. Every instinct told me to run, but curiosity and terror pushed me forward. I inched up, one step at a time, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, coming from my parents' bedroom. I realized the intruder must still be upstairs. I slowly moved toward their bedroom door. The doorknob rattled slightly. Someone was trying to open it. My grip on the knife tightened. I considered running back down, but then I noticed something on the floor, a trail of small, wet footprints leading from the bedroom to the hallway. I followed them carefully, terrified of being seen. At the end of the hall, I reached my own bedroom. I slid the door open and peered inside. I froze. On my bed, there was a note, scrawled in dark, messy letters. I could barely read it, but it said, "I see you." My stomach dropped. I dropped the note and stepped back. Someone had been inside my room while I was downstairs. That meant they had been watching me for hours. The thought made my skin crawl. I decided to hide in the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I crouched on the floor, pressed against the wall, trying to control my breathing. I could hear the intruder moving upstairs again, steps dragging across the floor. Then a soft knock came from the bathroom door. My heart stopped. The knock came again, louder this time. Someone was trying to get to me. I grabbed my phone and texted my neighbor silently. "Call the police. Someone is in my house." My fingers shook so much I almost dropped it. I pressed the send button, hoping it went through. Then I heard the bathroom door handle jiggle. I could see the shadow of someone through the crack under the door. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the handle stopped moving, and the footsteps went away. I stayed in the bathroom for what felt like hours, listening to the house creak and the wind howl outside. At one point, I thought I heard whispers. They were soft, unintelligible, but I could feel the words intended for me alone. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I didn't want to give away my location if the intruder was still nearby. Finally, I decided I had to make a move. I waited until I heard the intruder leave my parents' bedroom again, then slipped out of the bathroom and ran to the front door. My hands were bleeding from gripping the knife so tightly, but I didn't care. I opened the door slowly, peered outside, and saw nothing. No one. The street was empty, just a fog rolling across the lawn. I ran to my neighbor's house again, banging on the door. The police arrived a few minutes later. They searched the house thoroughly, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no footprints other than the ones I had already seen. The note was gone. They said it might have been someone playing a cruel prank, but I knew better. It felt deliberate, personal. I knew someone had been inside, watching me, moving silently, knowing I was alone. Even after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I changed the locks, installed cameras, but every time I was home alone, I felt that cold breath on my neck, heard the soft steps in the hallway, and imagined someone watching from the shadows. I never stayed home alone again for more than a few minutes. The worst part wasn't what they did. It was what could have happened. That intruder could have been anyone. They could have returned. They could have been inside the walls, behind doors, hiding just out of sight. I learned that night that being home alone is not always safe. And I will never forget the fear of someone being in your house, watching you, and knowing you are completely alone. You made it to the end, but remember, the story doesn't always end when the video does. If you'd like to support the channel, please like, share, and subscribe. We'll meet again. Until then, take care.